Hi everyone, I'm Allie. I'm an artist and an educator, and today I'm going to walk you through the steps in creating your own Drypoint print. Drypoint belongs to the intaglio family of printmaking. Intaglio means to engrave into a material. The sunken area that you create holds ink and can create prints on paper. Drypoint refers to the needle that is used in the drypoint process to engrave the material. Most dry points use copper or metal plates and a printing press to add as much pressure to the copper plate as possible and print all of the ink on the surface. Because few people have access to these kinds of facilities in a normal year, much less in a pandemic year, we're going to create our Drypoint prints using an alternative and more accessible format that uses hand pressing. To create your own Drypoint print, you will need mixed media paper, a pencil. I've used a fine-tipped marker, but you could also use a pen, a glue stick, a mechanical pencil, a sewing needle, a piece of felt or other scrap piece of fabric, scissors, and a disposable plastic food container. The important thing here is that the surface is flat and has no ridges, because that will impact how your print appears on paper. This is a Drypoint needle. It's what's typically used in the Drypoint engraving process. If you have one, great. If you don't worry, we're going to make one in this workshop. Newspapers. If you don't get these to your door, you can always call your local convenience store to see if they have any day-old newspapers that they've had to recycle. A clean, dry cookie sheet, a spray bottle, intaglio ink. I've used Acua intaglio ink here, but you can find other brands of this online or at most craft and art supply stores. I've included an Amazon link in the description below. Paper towel, pliers, and wire cutters. Okay, so let's develop a drawing that we will use to create our print. Because Drypoint uses lines that are engraved to hold ink, gradients and shading can't be created with pressure and blending like we use when we are creating a pencil drawing. But there are some other techniques we can use instead. Here are 4 drawing techniques you can use to improve your prints. All of these create depth by creating a sense of shading. First step, hatching. By creating short vertical lines at varying distances from one another, you create the illusion of depth. The second, cross-hatching. Cross-hatching creates this illusion by using both vertical and horizontal lines. Avoid creating X's and repeating them over top of each other when cross-hatching. Stippling. The drawing technique we all love to hate. It's time-consuming but effective. By creating dots on your page, clustering them to one end, and layering them on top of one another, you create a gradient that can also indicate texture. And finally, scumbling. Scumbling uses scribbling in a circular motion, layering on top of itself, to create different concentrations of ink on the page that reflects a gradient and also texture. Next, we need to create our printing plate. So cut around the outer edge of your plastic food container so that you are left with only the flat surface. Peel off and wash any stickers, taking care to preserve the sticker-free side of your container. So you don't want to use anything abrasive on that area that would accidentally create any indentations into the side that we're going to use to print. The great thing about using plastic to print on is that it's really easy to cut, so you can have any shape of printing plate that you want. If you want a square, great. I've chosen to go with a circle for my design. Then you want to trace it onto a piece of paper so that you'll know where the boundaries of your design will be. Okay, so now I'm ready to develop my design. I'm going with a really simple floral design, using simple clean lines and those drawing techniques that we talked about. So you can see a little bit of scumbling in some of my flower petals as well as stippling. I'm always starting with pencil first because mistakes happen, and as you can see, I've sort of reworked this design quite a bit. And after I'm done in pencil, I'm going over the whole design in ink so that it gives me really clear lines to draw from. Now that I've got my design all copied out, I'm just checking my printing plate to make sure it's the right size and doing any adjustments that I might need to make. Now it's time to create our dry point needle. So you're going to need your pliers, wire cutters, needle, and mechanical pencil. You're going to take the wire cutters and grip your needle and chop off the little end that you would normally put your thread through, leaving you with just the pointy end. Then you're going to act as if you were loading your mechanical pencil with lead, but instead you're loading your needle. So you're going to want to look for a needle that's comparable to the size of lead that your mechanical pencil holds. And there you have it, your do-it-yourself dry point needle. So now we're ready to engrave our plate. So you're going to look for the side of your printing plate that has the most damage. So on mine, you can see there's a little bit of the sticky that I wasn't able to get off. Maybe there's some scratches or something on yours, but find that side and just add a couple of passes of glue. Give it a moment to not fully dry, but just become tacky, and then place your plate over top of your drawing, lining it up with the edges that you traced out. And press it down firmly. The last thing you're going to want is for this to shift around when you're trying to engrave. Then you're going to grab your dry point needle, either the store-bought version or the DIY version we created earlier, and you're going to trace over all of the lines in your drawing. Using medium to firm pressure, you're trying to create a solid indent that the ink can adhere to. And as I'm doing this, I'm always holding on to my printing plate. Even though it's stuck down, there's still a chance that it could lift and shift, and then I've got to do a whole bunch of realigning in order to get my image to add up again. You can also lift the corners of your plate if you're having trouble seeing where you've already done your engraving. Allowing your plate to reflect some light will make it easier to see those engraved marks. So now you'll want to decide how many prints you want to make and get the number of pieces of paper ready. So you can place your printing plate on top of your paper and cut it to the size you would like your borders to be. Then you're going to take a couple of those paper pieces and place them on your cookie sheet and spray both sides down with water. Drypoint paper needs to soak because it helps to draw the ink out of those reservoirs that we've created. That's also why we can't use standard printer paper, because the paper won't hold up to the soaking process. I like to give myself a tool that I can use to apply ink to the surface of my plate. Ink is thicker than paint, so you can't apply it with a paintbrush easily because it's too thick and it won't actually get into the indentations that you're trying to place the ink into. So in this case, I cut a strip of my felt, roll it up, and safety pin it together. The pin's not totally necessary, but it makes it helpful when I'm picking it up and putting it down. But before we actually ink our plate, we're going to get our newspaper ready so that everything's all ready to go. So newspaper is what we're going to use to rub the excess ink off of our printing plate. So you want to bunch it up really tight and fold pieces of paper over top of that bunched area and create a flat surface. So pat it down with your hand and on the table to make sure that that area is nice and flat. If it's too bumpy, it'll actually pull the ink out of the engraving that you've created. And finally, you're ready to ink your plate. So dip your felt or fabric in your ink and rub it onto your plate in circular motions, going over all of the areas that you've engraved. Once the area is entirely filled in, you're going to grab your newspaper and begin wiping from the center outward. Remember, ink is stiff, so it's going to be a little tricky to pull. You're going to have to really grip the plate firmly with your fingers, and you will probably get a little inky during this process. So starting in the center, wiping outwards, and rotating your plate. So it's repeating that kind of circular motion. You're pushing the ink off of the plate, but you're also pushing the ink that is in the engraving throughout the engraving. And you're going to continue this process until your plate is entirely clear except for the areas that you've engraved. If you're worried about your hands getting too inky, you can apply hand cream before beginning this process, and it'll help the ink wash off your hands a little easier when you're done. If you find your newspaper is getting too inky, to effectively remove ink, you can add another layer of newsprint on top and re-flatten it out to continue to remove ink. Once you've removed the majority of the ink, you can begin to buff in circular motions with your newspaper to remove what's left. So once you've removed most of the ink from the surface of your plate, you can go in with a Q-tip and fine-tune some of the smaller areas that are still holding ink. And your plate is ready to print. So now it's time to finish getting your paper ready. If it's still so wet that it's shiny, dab it with some paper towel to make sure that it's matte. If it's shiny, it's too wet. If it's matte but still damp, it's ready to go. If your paper is dried by now, maybe you had a really extensive drawing and it took you a long time to etch it, it's fine to go ahead and re-wet your paper. So just spray it down again, flip it over, spray it, leave it for 1 or 2 minutes, and then pat it dry with your paper towel. And now you're ready to print. So grab your printing plate, ink side down, and hover it over your paper to decide where you'd like to place it. Place it down on your paper and apply pressure. So I'm using my fingernail here, but you can use almost anything to apply pressure. I've used pen caps, the side of a pencil. I've used old gift cards, a really great tool because they're nice and flat and you can apply pressure that way. Just be really careful that your printing plate doesn't move, because if it moves, it's going to create a really wonky repeated image instead of just one image. If you're finding your paper is having some issues due to it being wet, you can add another piece of paper on top of your paper and printing plate and then apply pressure on top of that. So you can use the side of a pencil that way. A really great tool actually is your ink container because it's solid, so it will create that extra leverage that you need to press the ink into the paper. And remember, the benefits of printmaking is that it's a repetitive process. So you can repeat this process as many times as you like. If your first print doesn't turn out perfectly, you can try it again. You can even come back to it the next day if you wash your plate with soap and water. There you have it, your final print. And that's all for today's printmaking workshop. If you enjoyed it or gave Drypoint a try at home, leave me a like and a comment below letting me know how it went. Thanks so much for joining me in my studio, and have a great week.